One of the most frustrating things a person can experience is realizing they keep making promises to themselves and breaking them. Maybe you've experienced this before in your own life. You make a decision that you're finally going to change something. You tell yourself that you're going to wake up early, become more disciplined, spend more time with God, stop a certain habit, or simply start taking life more serious. And in that moment, you may genuinely mean it. You feel motivated and confident that things are finally going to be different. But then a few days go by and you slowly start to slip back into the same patterns that you said you were done with. You sleep in again, you delay the things you told yourself you would do, and eventually you start realizing that you've broken another promise that you have made to yourself. I've experienced that in my own life as well. And over time, I begin to realize that the real issue isn't that people don't want to change. Most people genuinely do want to grow. The deeper issue is that we often try to build discipline without structure, and we try to build standards without truly understanding what it means to live by them. So today I will discuss 5 points to give you a better understanding of this issue. Let's get into the video. Okay, point number one. One of the first things I had to confront in my own life was the fact that many of my standards were just vague ideas. I would tell myself things like, I need to be more disciplined, or I need to do better. But when you really stop to think about it, those statements don't really define anything. They sound good in theory, but they do not create clear expectations of how you're supposed to live. A real standard removes negotiation because it is clear and specific. It defines what you are willing to do and what you are no longer willing to allow in your life. Without that clarity, every decision becomes a small debate in your mind, and eventually those debates slowly wear down your discipline. There's a verse in James 5:12 that says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. When I start to think about that verse in context of discipline, it made me realize how serious our word is supposed to be. If we say that we are going to do something, our yes should actually mean yes. But when we repeatedly say yes to commitments and then fail to follow through, something begins to change internally. And over time, we will start to lose confidence in our own word. Okay, point number two. Another reason that people break promises to themselves is because that they unwillingly allow their emotions to dictate their actions. When motivation is high, discipline feels easy, and we believe we finally become the person we want to be. But eventually, motivation fades, and when that happens, the real test begins. The problem is that many of us have learned to act only when we feel ready, energized, or inspired. When those feelings disappear, our commitments usually disappear with them. But the reality is that emotions are extremely unstable. They shift depending on our energy levels, our environment, our stress, and even something as simple as whether we slept in the night before. Jesus actually describes this struggle very clearly in Matthew 26:41 when he says the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. That verse captures the tension that almost everyone experiences. Deep down, we genuinely want to grow and live with discipline, but our flesh constantly pulls us toward comfort and convenience. If we build our habits around how we feel in the moment, we will constantly find ourselves drifting away from the commitments we once had. Okay, point number three. Another thing that I noticed in my own life was how much my environment influenced my discipline. For a long time, I believed that willpower was the main factor behind success or failure. But over time, I realized that environment plays a much larger role than we think. Our environment constantly shapes our behavior in subtle ways. The habits we build in our daily routines, the distractions we allow into our lives, and even the people that we spend all our time around all influence the decisions that we make. Proverbs 13:20 says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. That verse highlights how strongly our environments and our relationships shape who we become. If our environment consistently encourages comfort, distractions, and laziness, it becomes incredibly difficult to live with discipline, even if we genuinely want to. Structure, therefore, is not about internal motivation. It is intentionally about shaping the environment around you so that discipline becomes easier and temptation becomes harder. Okay, point number four. One thing I noticed when I was reflecting on my own habits was how rarely discipline collapses in one dramatic moment. Most of the time, it slowly erodes through small compromises that seem insignificant in the moment. It might look like delaying a responsibility that you know that you should handle right away. It might be even something small like deciding to skip a habit you committed to building. Each of those moments might feel minor by themselves, but over time they start to form a pattern. Your mind slowly learns that the promises you make to yourself are flexible rather than firm. Luke 16:10 says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. When when we consistently break small commitments, we are essentially training ourselves to treat our own word lightly. And that makes it extremely difficult to build the kind of discipline that we say we want. Okay, point number 5, the final realization that challenged me was understanding that many of the commitments I made had no real accountability attached to them. If I failed to follow through, nothing actually happened. Life simply continued as normal and the promise quietly disappeared. But standards without accountability eventually turns into suggestions rather than commitments. Galatians 6:7 says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap." This verse reminds us that our actions carry consequences. When we take our commitments seriously and begin enforcing standards into our lives, we start rebuilding a sense of integrity with ourselves. At the end of the day, discipline is not about becoming a whole different person overnight. It is about slowly rebuilding trust with your own word. When you begin making commitments and actually keeping them, even in small ways, something powerful begins to change in your life. Your confidence grows, your habits become stronger, and your identity begins to align with the standards that you believe in. And over time, you realize that discipline is not something that just appears out of nowhere. It is something that is built decision by decision and promise by promise. If you're watching this and you recognize this pattern in your own life, I want to ask you one simple, honest question. What is one promise that you keep making to yourself that you keep breaking? Because rebuilding discipline often begins with that one promise that you decide to keep.